Dr. Postell, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so glad to have you with us for the second in our series on checks and balances in the U.S. Constitution. And today, I think you're going to be speaking with us about the founder's inspiration for checks
Yeah,
and balances. And
yeah,
our episode is entitled Balancing Act, the founder's big idea. So I'm going to turn it over to you for some opening comments.
yeah. Thank you so much, Ms. Gillespie, for having me on, and thank you so much for Constituting America team. The opportunities and knowledge you provide for students and the general public are remarkable and essential, and I'm proud to be involved in the important work that you do, at least for the day. As was mentioned, I'm Samuel Postell. I'm the Assistant Director of the Lyceum Scholars Program at Clemson University, where I also teach. If any students are interested in the American founding and the great books and the way the ideas in those works interact with one another, I highly recommend that you consider the Lyceum Scholars Program and our work here at Clemson. Um, Although I am very excited to be here talking to you today, I must admit that this is quite the daunting task. I'm not exactly thankful for this big question. Uh, for example, we cover this question over the course of 3 semesters in our Lyceum Scholars Program. And an extensive series could be written on this question alone, and there'd still be much to be discovered and a lot to be debated. So, instead of pretending to provide a comprehensive answer to this question about ancient political thought, modern political thought, and the founding, I will opt for saying something interesting and potentially provocative. My assertion for today will be that the American founders learned from the wisdom of the ancients. They learned from history. They interacted with Enlightenment political thought. However, what they achieved was novel, innovative, and completely new in political thought. It was nothing short of revolutionary, and it should be treated as such. For example, John Adams explains the revolutionary theory of American politics in a letter from 1818 to Hezekiah Niles, a guy who was a paper editor. Hezekiah wanted to know, what is this American Revolution? When did it begin? And John Adams claimed that the actual revolution occurred before the fighting had even begun. It occurred in the hearts and minds of the American people. America's idea was revolutionary, but so was the form of government that it created to embrace that idea. Alexander Hamilton asserted, for example, in Federalist 14, that, and I quote him, America can claim the merit of making the discovery of unmixed and extensive republics. So, what was America's great revolutionary achievement? The great achievement was to create a republic based on the self-evident truths of natural rights, and furthermore, to create a framework, a government that preserved those natural rights and engaged them in the process of self-government throughout time. In Federalist 1, Hamilton boldly claims that Providence had reserved the right for Americans to decide the important question of whether or not societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Hamilton asserted that free government had never before produced good government based on reason and individual choices. Instead, free government, according to Hamilton, from the very outset of the Federalist Papers, had always devolved to rule by accident and force. It had always been a failed concept. The big question that the framers undertook is whether or not man can be both free and self-govern justly and create good government. Hamilton extends this theme in Federalist 9, and he takes another look at history. He boldly claims that the petty republics of Greece and Italy were kept perpetually vibrating between the extremes of anarchy and tyranny. Although these republics sought liberty and they created republican governments, they ended up furnishing arguments, Hamilton said, for despotism, and they produced spectacles of horror. Instead of securing self-government and freedom, they led to mob rule or one-man rule because the structure of their government was inadequate to secure liberty self-government, and prevent tyranny. However, in Federalist 9, Hamilton goes on to remark that, and I quote him, "The science of politics has received great improvements," and that these improvements were not known at all to the ancients, or they were imperfectly known by the ancients. He lists 4 of these improvements in Federalist 9. And then he adds one more after that, and that's the important one. The 4 improvements that Hamilton mentions in Federalist 9 are, first, the regular distribution of power into distinct departments. Second, legislative checks and balances. Third, courts composed of justices holding their offices during good behavior. Fourth, representation of the people in the legislature. The 5th is the enlargement of the orbit, or the creation of this large republic, which he says is novel in Federalist 14. The 5th is the most important, but at the time of ratification was also by far the most controversial. Hamilton continues to argue that the extension of the orbit has been the principal objection to the new Constitution. Why? Well, because it departs from the thought of the celebrated Montesquieu, as they called him frequently in the Federalist Papers. Montesquieu and the Anti-Federalists argued that liberty could only be secure in a small republic, where beliefs were uniform and virtue and agreement was more likely. The Anti-Federalists charged that such a large government was a recipe for consolidation, and thus incompatible with liberty and self-government. Hamilton rejects the Anti-Federalist belief and Montesquieu's plan in Federalist 9, arguing that the scope that Montesquieu suggests is smaller than any state in the Confederacy under the Articles of Confederation. But that still leaves a question. Why did Publius believe that the extended sphere could not result in consolidation of power? To explain this, we must understand 3 of the 4 modern improvements that Hamilton points out in Federalist 9. These are explained in Federalists 47 through 51. In Federalist 47, Madison admits that consolidation of power into one set of hands is the very definition of tyranny. Federalist 47 through 50 suggest inadequate methods of prohibiting this consolidation, and Federalist 51 finally solves the problem. In Federalist 51, Publius argues that to control abuses of power, the Constitution contrives an interior structure so that the mutual relations between the branches are the means of keeping one another in their proper places. In other words, one branch will check another branch if it tries to consolidate power. In order for this to occur, however, each branch must have a will of its own, and each representative must have the personal motives to stop other branches from trying to consolidate power and govern tyrannically. In order for public servants to have the proper motives, the public servant's interests must be tied to the constitutional rights of the place where he holds office. If the interior structure is so constituted, according to Publius, ambition will be made to counteract ambition. This is the remarkable insight of Federalist 51. The remarkable insight is that ambition, the very thing that usually leads to the consolidation and abuse of power, is used as a positive force to prohibit injustice and abuses of power and to preserve liberty. Publius notes that the primary control against consolidation and tyranny is a dependence on the people, but the Constitution creates this auxiliary precaution to ensure an additional protection. In Federalist 10, when Publius speaks of the large republic or the extended sphere, he makes an equally paradoxical and shocking argument. He begins by identifying faction as the mortal disease of self-government. It's the disease that's going to kill freedom and free government. But he argues that by enlarging the sphere, by creating a large republic, you invite more factions, and this solves the problem. How can that be? He says, and I quote him, "You make it less probable that a majority will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens." In other words, because a large republic possesses more diversity of opinions, more diversity of passions, and more diversity of interests, it is unlikely that a narrow passion, interest, or opinion will capture the entire nation and create a majority bent on abusing power. So, just as Federalist 51 uses ambition as the solution to ambitious consolidation, Federalist 10 uses faction as the antidote to the disease that is faction, the mortal disease that is faction. But another question remains. Why tolerate faction at all? Because, as Publius says in Federalist 10, the latent causes of faction are sown into the nature of man. But why tolerate ambition? Because, as Publius argues in Federalist 51, men are not angels. You can't make them angels and you can't make them perfect. Government, Publius says in Federalist 51, is the greatest of all reflections on human nature. And herein lies the heart of America's revolutionary political theory and how they depart from all of these thinkers that they read, Hobbes, Locke, Montesquieu, Plato, etc. Although the framers learned from history, and although they learned from the theory of others, they had a constant eye to human nature. They believed that man was naturally free, but they also recognized that he was naturally flawed. Nevertheless, they had faith that man, however flawed that he might be, still had the natural right and the natural capacity to govern himself. This, I contend, is the greatest revolution in political theory, and it's also its greatest blessing. It's the very blessing that you all at Constituting America fight so hard to preserve, and for that, I thank you. Thank you so much, and I welcome your questions.
Well, thank you. That was a great overview and such a good lead in to our series that we have coming up on checks and balances for the rest of the summer, really going through Constitution Day. So Wyatt, we're going to go to you first for questions.
Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Postell, Dr. Postell, for talking. This is such a fascinating discussion and very complex too. I was just trying to jot down all these notes, and I'm afraid I might have missed some too. But that's what these questions are for, to help further dive into this topic. So let's see, where do I want to begin? I want to say too, I really enjoyed how you're talking about the checks and balances. Um, we have talked about the struggle between branches and how it's actually helpful
Mhm.
to ensure this system of checks and balances, where if each branch is independent enough or has that individual drive to get the power, the other branches can help, what you might call it, they can help check the other branch, and that way our system remains intact of separation of powers.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And key to this, I will say, is that the representative or the public servant, his interests, and interest is a very important and I think overlooked word in the Federalist Papers, both in Federalist 51 and in Federalist 10, right? The word interest is used and it opposes opinion and passion when Madison defines faction. But the key to this is that the interests of, right? Each representative, each public servant has to have the proper personal motives, and his interests must be tied to the constitutional right of the place where he serves. That's absolutely key. And this causes some reflection on modern politics, right? The question is, do we see this in modern politics? Is each representative in the House of Representatives, let's say, is his primary interest in the constitutional rights of the House of Representatives, or is his interest engaged in something else? That's a big question, and that's a good litmus test uh, for the character of the people who are our public servants and whether or not they're properly poised to defend the separations of powers.
Absolutely. So you're talking about the philosopher Montesquieu. Were there any other philosophers that were also important to this system of checks and balances, and maybe that were addressed in the Federalist Papers as well?
Yeah, yeah. Montesquieu is really heavily addressed. Actually, in Federalist 47, I think it's the best takedown of Montesquieu. I didn't really get into this in my talk, but Madison says that he makes the comparison just as the Greeks saw Homer as the oracle for all poetry, Montesquieu saw the British Constitution as the oracle for all good government.
Mhm.
And in that one line seems to be the biggest takedown of the Anti-Federalists and of Montesquieu, right? Because the Americans, they don't just want to reproduce what Britain has created. Of course, they felt the abuses of this kind of power. So Montesquieu figures very heavily in the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers, they give glancing references to these different thinkers. So the quote that I opened with from Hamilton, Federalist 14, he says that America can merit the achievement of creating an unmixed and large republic. I think I take that to be speaking directly to Aristotle and the idea of a mixed regime, right? Hamilton seems to be saying that what we've created is not just modeled after Aristotle's understanding of a mixed regime, it's something completely different. Um, Plato, I think, figures in a little bit. I think this is more of a glancing reference, but I think that he figures in Federalist 10 a little bit. What Madison says in Federalist 10 um, is that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. In the Republic, uh, Plato talks about the ship of state, and he says that the proper captain of the ship of state, he's going to be a stargazer, and he's going to look at all kinds of different things, and he's going to gain wisdom from this. Madison in Federalist 10 says that we can't rely on enlightened statesmanship to save us, because A, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, but B, Madison argues that even the enlightened statesmen will not possibly be able to look at all of the remote considerations that have to do with statesmanship in an enlarged republic with so many interests, passions, and opinions. Furthermore, the enlightened statesman, Madison argues, will be ambitious. He will have interests of his own. So we can't just rely on statesmanship to save us all the time. We can't rely on giving the smartest man or the strongest man the power and then just think that we'll get good government and he'll secure our freedom for us and then just leave us free to live our lives. And even enlightened statesmanship seems inadequate for Madison. It seems like it would be helpful, but you can't fully rely on it. In other writings, not so much in the Federalist, but in a lot of other writings, the framers consulted all kinds of different thinkers. I think the biggest thinker for the framers was probably Locke. I don't think that the framers completely adhered to Locke's thought, but I do think that Locke's idea of nature, the state of nature and natural rights, it definitely figures into the creation and the writing of the Declaration of Independence. But one of the interesting things is that there are these self-evident truths, these natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, in Locke, it's life, liberty, and property. It's not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the Virginia Constitution at the time, it was life, liberty, and property. So that's kind of interesting. And I've always wondered why the committee why the framers decided to use pursuit of happiness instead of property in the Declaration, but they used property in the Virginia Constitution. So that's something that I've always been interested in. Pursuit of happiness seems to be a sort of nod to Aristotle, but I'm not sure if that's exactly what they're doing. It seems like they want to provide the low and the high protections of liberty, right? At the very least, human beings' lives have to be preserved by governments. Governments are responsible for protecting the lives of citizens. But they want to extend this all the way from not just preserve life, but preserve liberty, free life, and then also to preserve the opportunity for individuals to freely pursue happiness, to live the good life.
Absolutely. A lot of amazing information in there. And I know I've said this on the podcast before, but it always just amazes me how well educated all of our founding fathers were. I mean, they were talking about Aristotle, Locke, Plato, all these philosophers. And I know this is time before Google and YouTube and before we can actually watch and listen more easily now. It's just so impressive to me that they were able to not only understand what they were arguing, but also come up with their new arguments and based off of theirs in response to them.
Yeah, and they read them in the original language. Sometimes they would, take them from the original language, Greek,
Mm.
and they would translate it into, say, French because they needed to brush up on their French or something like that. So they also knew all of the original languages. There's this funny correspondence between John Adams and Abigail Adams when they're talking about how they're going to educate their children. And they're really focusing on what kind of language they're going to teach them first. Are they going to teach them Greek? Or are they going to teach them Latin? And how are they going to teach them about these languages?
Mhm.
It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I did not know that. That's wow.
Yeah.
Definitely could not be me. But so you also brought up the British government. I was going to ask, were there any influences? I know we just broke away from, British Parliament, but surely we took some lessons from that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, experience was a great teacher for the founders. So I will say I will stick with my provocative thesis, and I will say that the experience under the British government and its tyranny was the most fundamental to informing the founders when they created their own government. I think that they really looked at nature and experience, right? And they used the wisdom that they had gleaned from all these other sources, and they looked at their own situation and they evaluated what they should do about that situation. So there's, of course, that they learned from the experience under the British government. But there are various things, of course, that they took from the British form of government. The idea of two houses, right? That seems to be an idea that's embraced in the British Constitution. However, one that represents the people and one that represents the nobles is kind of done away with, although it seems like our Senate and our House are constituted on the same kind of model sometimes. Um, One of the biggest things I think that America kept from Britain is the idea of the common law, and the idea of the common law providing stability within the courts of justice. In my work on Henry Clay, there was one thing that I learned was there was this big movement in Kentucky, which of course was a part of the state of Virginia, and then it becomes Kentucky. Henry Clay moves from Virginia to Kentucky, and there's a big movement to do away with the common law. And Clay fought very hard to keep the common law as an important part of the legal system in Kentucky. So that's also very interesting. I think Blackstone and the common law and all of these things, they were very informative to the framers.
Absolutely. And you were saying that about Henry Clay, who was defending it.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
For those who are watching the podcast, I will like to. We were talking about this beforehand that you have a portrait of Henry Clay in your
yeah,
office where you're zooming in today. So
that's
yeah,
right.
just a fun little shout out to Henry Clay. So how do the founding fathers, specifically James Madison, who helped obviously write a lot of these Federalist Papers, defend this new government against people who thought, well, there's too many mixes of like the checks and balances. They should just only be independent, or they're interacting too much. How did they counter that?
Yeah, so I really think that Federalist 47 through 51 is the key to this whole arrangement, which is why I highlight it. But Madison, when he's taking on Montesquieu in Federalist 47, he argues that powers need to be distributed and blended, um, distributed into distinct departments and blended. And through that blending of these different branches of government, they have an important role to play in certain things that the other branches do. So I always harp on my students when they use the term separation of powers. We get that from Schoolhouse Rock. When the Federalist explains this, they explained it as the distribution of powers, just as Hamilton does in Federalist 9, and Madison explains the distribution of powers into distinct departments and the blending of those powers in a certain way. In a certain way. And this is something that's very contrary to what Montesquieu believes is possible. He believes that if you blend powers, then naturally they're going to end up being consolidated into a set of hands, whether that be one, few, or many, or something like that. And Madison's insight, which you only later get to in Federalist 51, where you see the contriving the interior structure so that ambition counteracts ambition, you only see why the blending is important once you get to Federalist 51. Because the House and the Senate, they both have to pass a law, you're going to see them at loggerheads sometimes, and they're going to have the ambition to combat the power of the other branch if it becomes too powerful or too ambitious. The presidency as well, right? If the presidency becomes too ambitious, as it did, throughout the Jacksonian era, I think, then Congress will try to censure him, and will the Senate will say things about his use of power or his abuse of power. Um, and when he tries to veto, right? So the executive is in some sense blended with the legislature, and this is the most obvious blending. He has to actually sign the law, or he can veto the law. That's a sort of blending. And the Anti-Federalists and Montesquieu, they seem to be uncomfortable with this idea, but really Madison treats it as the kind of secret ingredient. And it really is a paradox. Just like I presented ambition to counteract ambition as a paradox, blending to control is kind of a paradox, right? You would think that if you blended these things together, you would give the executive the opportunity to encroach. If you involve him in the legislative power, why won't he become involved more and more over time and encroach, and vice versa with any other branch? But this is really the secret ingredient. Secret ingredient is the proper blending of the branches. But importantly to this process, each branch still has to have a will of its own. That is very important. They can be blended, but they each have to have a will of their own.
Fascinating. And as I said too, it just amazes me how much they were able to take from, as you were saying, their experience, their knowledge of history, as well as their own philosophical ideas, and how what makes a government and how do we secure a government that's not tyrannical as the one that we had just experienced, but is serving the people and making sure that our rights are protected. And so just an absolutely fabulous discussion. I am almost out of time, so I'm just going to go ahead and pass it over to Jewel. Thank you so much, Dr. Postell.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wyatt. It was great to meet you.
Nice meeting you too.
Hello, Dr. Postell. This is Jewel Gilbert here. For anybody who is listening, this is a fantastic show, and it's one that I've already thoroughly enjoyed, and now I'm going to really enjoy getting to pick your brain about some of these things that are always kind of swirling around our discussions, and it takes a little bit of time to get into them, so we sometimes touch on them briefly, but they're fascinating to me, and they also underpin pretty much everything that we talk about in the constitutional show. So first of all, we'll talk about checks and balances as it's kind of presented in the show title. Like, so the founders were presenting checks and balances as a tool almost in order to ensure the protection of rights of men, and basically produce a government that had maximum liberty for the citizens. But that alone requires like a whole lot of agreement from people who disagreed about so much. So can you tell me about some of those things that means that they already were agreeing on that were fueling those ideas? Because even if they disagreed on how to get there, there's a lot of solidarity already established.
Yeah, yeah. So I kind of pointed this out or teased this at the very beginning of my talk, but I mean the fundamental agreement is the philosophic agreement, right? The philosophic agreement as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Men are, contrary to all history and contrary to the belief of some that they would call despots or tyrants or kings, contrary to these past ideas, all past political thought, and many people in the world in which they lived, human beings are naturally created equal and they are free. That's the fundamental agreement. And the question is, how do you preserve that freedom? And how do you preserve a system where self-government actually exists? So the fundamental agreement was the agreement on the basic idea of regarding human nature and justice. The basic idea being that human beings are naturally created free. The basic idea of justice is that you should leave them free and you should allow them to govern themselves rather than tell them what to do. And I think that with that philosophic foundation, right, all kinds of different ideas can arise about how you create a system that actually embraces self-government. But I think that the framers, despite how heated their arguments sometimes got, they all agreed on this basic understanding. And they even, I think, in my opinion, the vast majority of them even applied that theory to the most prominent issue of their day, slavery. Many of them understood that slavery was contrary to the Declaration and its principles. Jefferson even goes so far as to say, I tremble for my country when I know that God is just and that his justice will not sleep for long. The original Declaration of Independence had an indictment of the king for setting up slavery in America. It was later deleted to appease the Southerners so that they would sign it, but
Wow, that's a Thank you for including that quote, and thank you for including that information because it is important. It's like the founders, of course, they were politicians. Of course, you know, you can look at the the newspaper clippings, and the graphics where they would be calling each other names and stuff, and some of that stuff got intense. But at
Mhm.
the end of the day, it's interesting how there's a lot of intellectual honesty. It's like they're working together in the Federalist Papers to come to these huge ideas, and it's like they want to succeed, and they're teasing out these issues in kind of a really like a really vulnerable way because
Yeah.
they're honestly arguing them. And that kind of brings me, what your answer brought me to the next thing I wanted to kind of bring up for our viewers and for myself and get your view on it, is about freedom. So it keeps coming up. We just said that, so checks and balances is a tool that we can use in our understanding of the way that men are, the natural rights, the way that men operate, our human nature, as a way of preserving liberty. But our founders' view of liberty is very different from what a normal, like, grab
Mm.
me when I'm not thinking about this stuff and just ask me what freedom is. I might say freedom's doing freedom means I can do anything, or freedom means doing whatever I want, or something like that. But our founders had a very particular, refined, and important view of freedom. And I know that Aristotle had mentioned had talked about his view of freedom. I think Montesquieu and I think Locke. So could you tell us about what is liberty?
Another really easy question. Thank you so much, Jewel. No, this is very many books could be written on this and they would still be inadequate. But it's a great question. So this is something that I think that we can relate to Locke's thought and to Locke's influence, and particularly how he influenced those who produced the Declaration of Independence. Locke had an idea of both liberty and license, right? So liberty is the proper use of one's freedom. License is the improper use. Something licentious would be me not respecting your natural right to own your property. That looks like a very nice shirt that you have on, Jewel. Maybe after this podcast, I use my freedom to drive to wherever you happen to be, and I take your shirt from you. That would not be consistent with your liberty, because it would not be consistent with your property. I would be violating your rights. That would be what Locke would call license. If I were to steal from you, it would be the improper use of liberty. So liberty has limits, right? The limit on liberty is your natural rights. I can't use my freedom to infringe upon your natural rights. I can't do that as an individual, but I also can't do that as a member of a group who's competing to gain the powers of the government, right? And this is the big issue at the heart of Federalist 10 with faction, right? Whereas one man, me, might like your shirt so much that I might go see you and try and steal your shirt. We also have groups of men that discriminate against the rights of other groups of men, and they might try to seize power to do this. This is the problem of faction. And you might also have groups of men who have passions or opinions or interests, and they might try to seize the powers of the government to abridge the rights of other citizens. Or, as Madison points out, to use the powers of government contrary to the aggregate interests of the whole. So there are bounds for liberty, or there are bounds, I suppose, for freedom. Liberty is consistent with observing and respecting the rights of your fellow citizen. And of course, the Constitution tries to embrace this, right? The Declaration of Independence sets forth this theory, and I think this is foundational.
Yeah, and I want to move on to other questions, but just one more about this idea
Yeah.
of freedom. How important do you think it is when we're understanding our government, the what actually animates our founding documents and how to move forward? How important do you think it is to explore what you just said about liberty? I can tell you that in my formal education, like in college, I was homeschooled before that, so I did get a lot of I got to look at some of the stuff. But in college, in the class I took, I can be honest with you that even in one of my history class, U.S. history classes, we never examined that definition of liberty. And pushing that forward, then that really gives you a different understanding of our place as citizens in the public and the government. So, what do you think? Like, do you think there's an issue with us as citizens not understanding what liberty is? Like, what's your take on it as a teacher?
Hmm. Yeah, so on one hand, yes, and on another hand, no. There's a reason that it took so long for the world to wake up to the founders and the revolution's wisdom. But if you look at all of the changes, all of the regime changes that happened towards free government, then it's a really remarkable feat, which is why I say that it's the greatest revolution and the greatest blessing in political theory throughout world history. It lifted the shackles from a great number of human beings. And it doesn't seem, it's not an easy concept, but the Declaration of Independence calls these truths self-evident. And once you actually attend to the words that the founders wrote or spoke, then it becomes so obvious to you. It becomes so obvious to you that human beings, yes, the best way for them to be happy is for them to be free. And the best way for them to be unjust is to harm the rights of other people, to enslave other people, to impede others in the practice of their own liberty, to steal others' property. That's the worst way to live. It just becomes self-evident. The Declaration is absolutely right about this. It is a self-evident truth that men were created equal, with equal rational capacity to self-govern, and that they were endowed with freedom, and that if you try to twist human nature and take away that freedom, or take away the right of men to use their minds to govern themselves, then you get bad results. And the 20th century, all across the world, is a testament to this fact, because there were many regimes that did try to do that, that tried to actually change human nature, or tried to take away the right to liberty from human beings. And it always happened unequivocally with bad results. Plato argues, if we can get back to some of the original theorists, Plato argues that the tyrant is the least happy of all men. So it's not only the person whose liberty is abused who is unhappy. It's actually the abuser of other people's liberty and rights that is very unhappy. The tyrant is the least happy of all men.
And does that I'm one more aside, it's just to respond to what you said. When you had said about the pursuit of happiness, harkening back to maybe a nod to Aristotle, and we talk about happiness. I think that happiness might be another word that we probably have a slightly different modern understanding from what like the founders would have meant as writing the word. So pursuit of happiness as coming through, I know today's supposed to be kind of about checks and balances, but that means the checks and balances are trying to protect our pursuit of happiness. So what is the happiness that we're pursuing? What does that mean? Since we replaced property with pursuit of happiness.
Yeah. This is a fascinating question, Jewel. So a word that was often used is felicity among the founders. A word that I often use is flourishing, and the word that I think that Aristotle uses is eudaimonia. So what the pursuit of happiness is it's the pursuit of your end as a human being, right? As Aristotle would say, your telos, to become the best kind of human being that you can be. That's what happiness is. It's not maximizing the amount of pleasure. It's not maximizing the amount of possessions that you can have. It's becoming the best kind of human being that you can be, realizing your full potential. And it's interesting because I think that property is, I don't actually fault the founders for going back between these terms, but because I do think that property is one way that we actually do that as human beings, right? Through our property, through our innovation, through owning a business, we serve our fellow citizens. We provide jobs for people, we provide products for other people, and we engage in mutually beneficial exchange. We benefit ourselves while also benefiting others. Alexis de Tocqueville was very shocked when he was traveling through America because he realized that Americans had come about knowledge of the instinctive knowledge of self-interest rightly understood. meaning that I can benefit myself while also benefiting you. I do think that this is tied to property, but I think that that's part of realizing our potential as human beings. You can do that as a father, you can do that through business, you can do this as a member of some other association within society, like constituting America. But the pursuit of happiness is all about realizing your individual potential.
What an amazing, that's like inspirational. That's awesome. So then we'll get it back to checks and balances. So our founders were like, they're like tinkering scientists. It's on the way that they viewed it, a
Yeah.
little bit different the way as we separate the each of our subjects like into this is STEM or this is this. They didn't have quite a understanding of education on the winners trip that just happened in Washington D.C. Constituting America takes the winners to Washington D.C. of the We the Future contest, and we had an amazing performance by Thomas Jefferson, and he was telling us all about their understanding of the different subjects, we can call them.
Yeah.
And it's like they were creators, inventors with this government, almost the same way as you would build an engine.
Yeah.
And so for checks and balances, particularly, one of the things it seems like we're solving for is what they were positing as the real view of human nature. So if they got human nature wrong, then their machine would run wrong. And
Yeah.
and one of the things that I don't think we think about as much is that they didn't want the government to fall apart,
Mhm.
that it actually could fall apart. So could you tell us we normally are talking about, because our government has gotten so strong, we normally talk about the overreach of government or how it became more centralized. But could we talk about the opposite for a second and kind of the checks and balances based on their understanding of human nature to not let our government fall apart when it was at its infant
Yeah.
stages and not let a tyrant or a strong man rise to power and um, become a despot?
Yeah, this is another great question. So this is exactly what Hamilton is talking about. Now, if you read in Federalist 9, if you read the Federalist Papers and you look at the first paragraph of many of them, it talks about this word union, which is the topic of this book that I'm writing on Henry Clay, and it was kind of the topic of my dissertation. And yeah, they're very concerned with union. How can we have union? Now, Hamilton in Federalist 9, in that quote that I gave you during my remarks, he's very worried that if we don't have a constitution, if we don't have a firm union of the states, then the states, if we just keep the Articles of Confederation, then the states will become like those petty republics of Greece and Italy that vibrated between the extremes of anarchy and tyranny, right? In such a system where, the states are very small, factions can come in and they can take over the entire state and use the powers of the states for their own immediate purposes or to pursue their own passions, their own immediate and narrow interests. What you will have is you will have something like mob rule, Hamilton seems to believe. And then the result of mob rule is that you will see the problems of mob rule. The people are too ruly, they're not fit for self-government. And then you will give someone, a strong man, a bunch of power to come in and to stop the mob from ruling, and then he will rule, create stability. And Hamilton was worried that if the states remained small states, a confederacy, they would vibrate between these two extremes. They would never create a sort of stability for self-government. It would always be, in other words, the alternative between one-man rule or mob rule. So the goal of the Constitution was to create a framework where you could actually have stability. And this is what the checks and balances do, and the system itself does. It creates the requisite stability so that you don't err towards either one of those extremes. Now you can become more mobbish as a society, or you can have people within society that are conglomerating interests underneath them as they're running for office and all of these things. But the system, according to the Federalist, provides the requisite stability where the people can still fix the abuses of power if they arise. And Hamilton seems to contend that you can only have this in a large republic. And I would argue that history also contends this as well.
Yeah, I'm coming down to the end of my time, but I'd like you to just talking about the size of republic. So large republic versus small republic. This is a a thousands-year-old discussion. So tell me why you think you think that Hamilton was right a little bit more. Just, I know we only have a couple seconds here, but
Another another very big question to answer in a few seconds. Well, the one thing that I will say is that, it's very easy to look at the Civil War as evidence that the system would naturally break, that it was set up to fail or something like that. But through my research throughout on the antebellum period, it's actually quite remarkable that the system maintained itself as long as it did when it was posed with all the problems that it was posed with. Um, Jefferson says near the end of his life that he might have to die with the worry that it's this whole creation of the American Republic has been in vain, that the sons of the revolutionaries will destroy the founders' dream. But we overcame those issues. We overcame nullification. We overcame the Missouri crisis with a compromise. We overcame the crisis of 1850 with a compromise. And we did this through legislative means. Only in the legislature can you incorporate all the different interests, passions, and opinions of the people and accommodate those passions, opinions, and interests of the people. The legislature is the key to this whole framework. It allows you to actually accommodate the diversity of America and to actually legislate in such a way that generally the people remain satisfied. Now, it might be questionable whether or not the legislature still does this today, but throughout a very long period of history, the American constitutional system worked because the legislature did this. And I just think that history kind of vindicates this. This is not to say that there weren't problems, of course. The very first time that Madison stepped into the House of Representatives, he realized that this was a mess and that he might have been wrong about some things. And he wrote a bunch of party press essays. One of them was entitled Consolidation, so a nod to the Anti-Federalists. And he argued that because Congress could not govern, it was giving all of its power to the president, to the executive, and that the executive was consolidating power. So right when Madison became engaged in actually administering this government, he realized that it still had problems. But the beauty of the system is that the people and the people's representatives can overcome the problems that they face. It's not set in stone, but it's set in stone enough so that major abuses of power cannot occur.
it's fantastic. I think you gave all of us so much to look into, and thank you for those awesome answers to these huge questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jewel. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Well, thank you, Jewel and Wyatt and Dr. Postell. This has been a great discussion so far. And before we go to the audience questions, we want to recognize our teachers and students watching today. We have Kelly Bradford with Bradford Christian Academy, who's watching with students. Kenyon Wanos is a student watching. I know Hope Mucklow has students watching. If you are a teacher with students watching today, please message us in the Q&A, and we'll try to give you a shout out before the end of the program. And we also want to thank our listeners with Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats on Thursdays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to everyone in Las Vegas listening. So Dr. Postell, we're going to start with Robert McKeeman, who asks, what founding father was the most innovative in your opinion?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think that they all were, but my answer to this question is always James Madison. I think that Madison, his ability to devour history and past constitutions and to reflect upon them, and also to devour state constitutions before the constitutional conventions and evaluate them and present all of his findings to the Constitutional Convention while taking notes, while creating the Virginia Plan, which he didn't even present because he thought that everybody would be suspicious of it if he presented it. Randolph ends up presenting it. I think that he's the key innovator here. I think that he is the father of our Constitution, and he's the staunchest defender of the theory of our Constitution. And I think that the Federalist, which he, I think, writes many of the most interesting papers, in my opinion, is the best political theory in American history. So I think that Madison was by far the greatest innovator, and I also consider him the greatest founder because he was literally involved in laying and founding the nation, laying its foundations with the creation of the Constitution.
Well, and his notes on the Constitutional Convention are really fascinating. And I think it was a couple of summers ago, actually before Professor Gordon Lloyd of Pepperdine passed away, we had Professor Lloyd on a few of our chats talking about his edition that he edited of Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention. We use that as one of our book club books, and it was really a fascinating discussion. We have that archived on Constitute America's website. So if you go to previous episodes from our homepage, you can find that.
And Dr. Lloyd, I learned a lot from Dr. Lloyd, actually. He came and spoke at Ashland, and he taught a few classes at Ashland while I was there. And that's who produced that volume, was the Ashbrook Center where I was. So I am much indebted to all of his thoughtfulness about the convention.
Yeah, he was really amazing. We miss him. Going on to Brad Haston. Brad asks, with the factions playing such a big role, what role does virtue play with respect to the leaders of our republic? Is everything based on personal interests tied to the factions?
This is a wonderful question, and one that I was hoping to get into, and I didn't have time in my presentation. So this is another one of these questions, by the way, that I could be here all day talking about. So the founders did believe that virtue was very important, and they believed that individuals should be free, and they should use that freedom to try and live virtuous lives and become educated in virtue in civil society, right? This would do two things. It would allow individuals to become virtuous, but it would also not use the government to force them to become virtuous, right? These past petty republics had relied on the government. I mean, think of Sparta as the most obvious example of this, to produce public morals and public virtue. Montesquieu believed that these small republics were the surest, the small republics were surest to preserve liberty because you could assume a high degree of public virtue among persons. The founders, in almost all of their state constitutions at the time of the founding and the revolution, in their bills of rights and their constitutions, they have a nod to the maintenance of public virtue, and they have these laundry lists of public virtues that individuals have to have if they want to practice self-government. So virtue was absolutely important to the framers, and they were informed about virtue from these readings that they did, the ancients, the Enlightenment political thinkers, all of these things, and of course their own experience. So they were very interested in it. They thought that it was absolutely necessary. They thought that a good society cannot last without good men. But, and there's a big but to this, the Federalist Papers, and particularly Federalist 10, wants to assume that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, and that perfectly virtuous people will not always be governing. It wants to ensure that there's a safety net. What if people aren't always virtuous? What if you get people in power who pretend to be virtuous, and then they have deceived people, and they're not actually virtuous, and they have ulterior motives? Federalist 10 wants to create a fail-safe. And the fail-safe is inherent in the very definition of faction that Madison puts forward. So Montesquieu believed that the only way to protect liberty was among a virtuous population in a small republic with very similar interests. Madison argues that faction can come from three different things: opinion, passion, and interest. It seems to me that opinion and passion are the really scary ones. And interest is the one that can actually be controlled. So a few paragraphs after Madison lays out all of his understanding of faction and how you can't eliminate it and how it's sewn into the nature of man, Madison goes on to say that the regulation of economic interests is the principal task of modern legislation. So it seems to me that because our government is limited, what you want our government and our Congress to be doing is to consider the interests of the people primarily and to regulate those interests rather than simply attend to the passions and opinions, because passions and opinions are much more difficult to deal with, right? How are you going to get someone, if they're passionate about something, to be fully satisfied with the law that you passed? They're passionate about it. Maybe you won't go far enough. But if someone has an interest, if someone has a mercantile interest, then what you can do is you can pass a policy that will satisfy them. Plus, you get the benefit of this is not just a policy based on passion, but it's based on something a little bit more reasonable, right? Someone's livelihood. So what you can actually do is you can accommodate a variety of different interests in Congress, but it seems more difficult to accommodate a variety of different passions or opinions within Congress, because opinions and passions often clash. Interests, particularly economic interest, can be accommodated in some way.
Well, great answer. And we thank all the audience for all of your questions. And we're right at the top of the hour. I want to close with something from Lucia Booth, who says, now I'm anxious to read the Federalist Papers. In the 50s, my father told me to, but I never followed that advice. So you're having an impact today. And Lucia also says, while watching this fascinating discussion, I was wondering if our national public servants should have a seminar like this before taking the oath of office, and some courses in civics too. Our history is so important. Knowing our roots is critical. And so, Lucia, thank you for those comments. Thank you to everybody whose questions I didn't get to today. And thank you, Dr. Postell, for being our guest today. We're so appreciative. And I want to, before we sign out, and I'm going to go back to Wyatt and Jewel and you, Dr. Postell, just for any closing remarks you might want to make. I want to remind our audience that Monday night we have another episode 2 of our book club, where we're discussing The Return of George Washington, Uniting the States, 1783 to 1789 by Ed Larson. The sign-up link is in the Q&A queue, so grab that before we close out. And Wyatt, Jewel, and Dr. Postell, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much for being on. It was excellent. You were a wonderful, awesome guest.
Thank you.
Yeah, just as Jewel said, this was a fascinating and interesting discussion, and you just definitely helped make it even better. So thank you for being an awesome guest.
Oh, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate that. It was great to talk with both of you. You both asked phenomenal questions. I'd love to have you in class, to be honest. And one thing that I will just say to all viewers is I will just emphasize something that I think that I de-emphasized a little bit because there's just so much to cover. Federalist 51 argues that the primary security of liberty is a dependence upon the people. That is, you the people, we the people, us the people, right? So we all have a role to play in this. We are all the people. So it's our goal to ensure that the government is primarily dependent upon us, respects our liberty, and checks itself when it extends too far.
Thank you. Great closing comments. Thank you so much. So we'll see y'all hopefully Monday night for book club, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.